Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to talk about intimacy. So Valentine's Day is right around the corner, and I thought that would be a good time to revisit this. Now, we have talked about this before. We did a 3-part episode on the big 3 in marriage, and one of those was sexuality. And so we touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to touch on this idea of intimacy as more than just sexual, right? Because intimacy is more than just a physical thing. It's a need that is a basic human need. And so I thought it would be good to talk about the different ways in which we experience intimacy and then kind of go into emotional intimacy and why that matters in a relationship, a long-term committed relationship, and why it matters in terms of the physical intimacy.
You know, I was thinking about the term as you were talking about physical and emotional. In my work with couples, when I use the word intimacy, I'm always talking about emotional intimacy. And I think that over the years, I have really found that it's the more important one. I think that the sexual intimacy, especially in the beginning of a relationship, usually is pretty easy. Now, that doesn't mean it stays easy throughout the course of the marriage, but I think early on, for couples dating, if they're sexual, and then early marriage, the emotional intimacy, however, I think that's harder. That does not come as easily, especially to men. So I think it's a good thing we're talking about it.
Yeah. And I think emotional intimacy is going to lead to better sexuality in a relationship.
That's what I try and help. If I'm talking with a couple, say they've been married 10 to 15 years and their sexuality is lagging, and I know I'm going to make a generalization here, but often with generalizations, it's because they're somewhat accurate. And I think for women, 10 years on, they need to be emotionally connected. They want to feel emotionally connected to their partner before they then engage in sexuality. Whereas early on in the relationship, when you're first married, that's not as true because those hormones are pretty active for the women as well early on in the relationship. But so 10 years on, they want that emotional connection. And often, again, a generalization, their husbands haven't learned how to do that. And what I try and help the husbands understand, if you work on this, then your sexuality will generally increase and get better because you're fulfilling a basic need of, your spouse. I really believe that men, once they learn how to do this, it feels better for them also.
Yeah.
I think it's just culturally, we as men, we don't think about that emotional piece. And we think of sex as being purely a physical endeavor. But I know this is true for a lot of men in longer term marriages. The emotional piece does become more important.
Yes. And I think it's just because as men age, their sexual drive declines.
Right.
There's still need there. And so I think one thing too that men need to understand is for women, sex is very much tied to our emotions.
That's right.
It's so much more than just physical for women. And, oftentimes men are referred to as a light bulb and women are referred to as more of a toaster oven, right? Men, you flip a switch, they're ready to go.
I haven't heard that. I like that.
Right? But seriously, men, it's like it's a light switch. You flip it on, they're ready to go. Women, it takes more. Right.
I want to say this as I'm thinking about it, that there are going to be listeners who don't fit these generalizations. Yeah. I think we should acknowledge that there's certainly women who are going to be more physical and sexually wanting that more than their husbands, because I've seen it. And so I don't want listeners to think I haven't seen it. And there are going to be men who are more emotionally focused than their spouses. So again, this is a generalization. It does not fit for everyone. That's not what we're saying. It's just for the vast majority. This is the pattern I've seen for 25 years. And so I think there's something to it that men don't know how to connect in that emotion, how to be emotionally intimate, but they can learn.
Yes. And let's talk for a second about I'm picturing men who are like, you want me to talk about my feelings and right? Like, I mean, it may feel that way at first, but just push through because I promise it's worth it.
Right. And so I think a lot, I'm all about process and the words
Yeah.
we use. And so I never ask a man how he feels ever,
Okay. Okay.
because often the
Yeah.
word is confusing to them. What am I feeling? I don't know what I'm feeling. So for spouses, or generally you can say to a man, what was that like for you? So
Okay.
if you're talking about like some event happens and you say, well, how does that make you feel? They're going to go glassy-eyed, like the
Yeah.
deer in the headlight.
Uh-huh.
So you have the same event and you say, I'm interested. What was that like for you? They can answer that question.
Hmm.
And then what you have to do, and they'll often say an emotion word, but often just have to listen for it and you'll hear it. And
Hmm.
so it's, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is the cultural thing, some men think of emotions as being wimpy and feminine and they don't want anything to do with it. But a lot of it is they haven't been taught the vocabulary.
Yeah.
And I'm working with several men right now, a couple of them individually, some in couples, and I give them this list, and it's just this whole long list of emotions. And here's what I suggest they do is like 3 times a day, they check in with themselves and they look at the list and they say, okay, what am I feeling right now? And what that does is it helps them to increase their vocabulary. It helps them learn to be more aware. And what then eventually happens, they are more aware of their partner's
Hmm.
emotional state. And so it generalizes. And so I really believe men can learn. And I believe they're happier
Yeah.
once they do. Because it's like there's this whole part of our existence that they aren't accessing fully.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to be able to access it fully.
Yeah. And as we mentioned earlier, it's going to lead to better emotional intimacy, which is going to lead to better sexuality in a
Right.
relationship.
Right.
So,
More physical connection. So
yeah.
here's what I think that a person needs in order to be emotionally intimate is first you have to be able to be self-aware enough to know what your own emotional state is at
Hmm.
any moment. And so men often don't do that, but they can learn. That's that exercise that I just talked about. And that so once you're self-aware enough that you know what your emotional state is, the next thing is you have to have a vocabulary in which to express that emotion. And again, that's off people. Generally, men don't have that vocabulary. Although I think it's helpful for women to increase their emotional vocabulary as well.
Hmm.
Then the third step is be willing to share that with someone else, be vulnerable to share it with your intimate partner. And so I think, a lot of what we're going to talk about in a few minutes is what does that even look like? Because I get a lot of couples that come in and they know they want to be more emotionally intimate. They have no idea what that process looks like. So we can talk
Yes.
about that.
Yes. So before we do that, I want to backtrack a little bit. And I want to talk about this idea of intimacy in our families of origin.
Hmm.
So, or the intimacy needs of children, because I would imagine that if intimacy needs of children are not met, then it's going to be hard for them to be emotionally intimate when they get older.
Oh yeah, and this is, I mean, the word we put to this is attachment. I mean, what you're
Okay.
talking about is the attachment process. So I think I've mentioned before, John Gottman years ago, deviated a little bit from his marriage work and really focused on children. And so he calls it the heart of parenting or emotion coaching. I think he
Hmm.
calls it the same thing. And what that does, essentially, it teaches the parent how to be essentially emotionally connected with their child with a child, what you're doing is you're teaching them how to be emotionally aware. essentially putting words, so
Yeah.
you're teaching them the vocabulary. And if you think about it from a basic perspective, language is the thing that allows us to think and
Hmm.
feel. If we didn't have language, we wouldn't be able to describe what's going on with
We
us. And
wouldn't be
so,
human. We would be animals.
right. And so the what happens is this emotion coaching. I really think it's the parent-child equivalent to what I try and teach couples to do.
Okay.
It's very, very similar. It's kind of the same thing. And so growing up, I think it's one of our tasks as parents to teach our children to have empathy. We've talked about that before.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of the ways to teach that because once you become more aware of your own emotional needs, then you can be aware of someone else's. But going back to what that emotional intimacy in the family is, if the child's experiences being seen emotionally by the parent,
Hmm.
that's emotional intimacy
Yeah.
and the validation. That's where the connection comes. That's where the attachment comes. And I think that so if you get a couple, so you fast forward 20 years, 30 years, and you're married and you're having trouble attaching, you can learn how to do that through this same process as an adult, being able
Hmm.
to understand what your emotions are, have someone else see them and have them validated. And so you're right that the ideal way to do this is in your family of origin.
Right. And
Sometimes that doesn't happen though.
yes. And it doesn't have to be terribly complicated, parents. I'm telling you now. Really
No.
just start throwing emotions out there and see if one sticks. Kind of that
Right. And the
simple.
kid will tell you, right. And Gottman says this, and the parent, you might say, oh, it seems like you're really unhappy. And the kid might say, no, I'm not unhappy. I'm mad. Or so,
Yeah.
and you go
Hmm.
with whatever they come up with.
Yep.
And then you just go into it and say, well, I'd like to understand, what's going on that led you to be mad. So in that way, they become more self-aware. So it's okay to throw out emotion.
Yeah.
If you're wrong, the kid will tell you. It's
Yes.
okay to throw out an emotion to a partner. If you're wrong, hopefully they'll say, well, no, it's not that, it's this. And that process is really helpful because what that shows, it shows I'm noticing you and I notice that there's something different about you emotionally. Now, this is
Hmm.
also a part of Gottman's research that successful couples notice small emotional changes in each other.
Okay.
It's easy to see the big ones.
Hmm.
Oh, you're really happy, or oh, you're really mad. But what you want to do is notice the small changes and then acknowledge them or validate them, but don't let it just go. And
Hmm.
so that is also a skill that I think is learnable.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what emotional intimacy looks like in a couple. What is it?
So it's not, I get a lot of couples that they believe that emotional intimacy is anything that I think about you, I'm going to tell you.
Oh,
That's
no.
just I call it emotional vomiting.
Yeah.
It's
No.
not emotional intimacy. A lot of people misunderstand it. I get to tell you whatever's going through my head. And I know I've said this before. I think good relationships, good marriages have a lot of censorship.
Yeah.
Just because you think it in your head does not mean you get to say it to your partner. Some things
Yeah.
are better left unsaid, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you aren't emotionally intimate. It's you come home from a hard day at work, and I can tell you've had a hard day, and your partner comes up, and they may not even need to say anything. You get a touch, or you get a hug, or you might say, "I can see that you've had a hard day. When you want to talk about it, let's talk about it." See, that's emotional intimacy. That's part of emotional intimacy. I think the other thing that it is talking about your dreams moving forward. And whenever you're talking about things like that, it's really important that there's no judgment. And
Yeah.
so part of emotional intimacy is no judgment, and that
Hmm.
it's really about validation and understanding the other person where they're at. So a lot of what you want to do is create the context in the marriage where it's safe to
Yes.
do that. So I hear this talked about a lot. It doesn't feel safe to me to to say this thing to my partner. And so the first thing and usually what that's about is criticism.
Right.
I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, and then your partner criticizes you. So it's really important that there's no criticism in this process, because then what that does is allows the other person to feel safe in opening up. But I think in emotional intimacy can be as simple as laughing together.
Mm-hmm.
Having good sense of humor together, touching, certainly. That non-sexual touch, I think, is about emotional intimacy. Because what you're doing is you're giving this, unspoken message. I'm here for you. I'm right here. I'm connected to you.
Yep.
And you don't need to say anything. You're just touching. And I think another part of emotional intimacy is being a support to each other, being like you've got each other's back. Yeah, you're your partner, spouse's cheerleader, best cheerleader. And I really believe this is important. You never put down your partner, well, in private or public.
Yeah.
But if there's some sort of disagreement, if you disagree what's going on, you're always there in public. Either you're quiet or you're supporting, and then you can talk about your differences after.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're always, that you're on each other's side all the time.
Yes. And
That's
I think
that's part of emotional intimacy.
yes, and I think that's especially important to establish in front of family,
Mm-hmm.
especially
Oh yeah.
because your family starts to, and maybe they're not doing it intentionally, but they kind of start attacking your spouse. Even if you agree with your family, doesn't matter. Take your spouse aside anyways, and then talk about it individually when you're
Yeah.
not together. Because
Yeah.
no matter what, yeah,
Yes.
no matter what,
Yeah.
you need to be on their side.
That is so important. It really
Yeah.
is. You've got to always be there. And I've seen marriages fall apart because of that, because the partner didn't stand up,
Mm-hmm.
against their own family. So what I get couples who don't have that emotional connection. And so part of the process is teaching them how to do that. And, we won't go into any more detail than me just saying those 3 steps, which we've talked about before, to really listen and understand, to validate and have empathy. But that's not enough, because a lot of, like I'll say to couples, you need to increase the time that you're together. Now you hear this more than you do now, at least I do. The quality time is more important than quantity time, and I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I think that you got to have both.
Yeah.
That you got to have quality time, but you've got to have quantity time, because every time you're together is not going to be quality. But if you increase the amount of time that you're together, then you also naturally increase the time that you're going to have that quality time.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to connect, if you want to learn about your partner, you have to be together. You have to put away your phones, your iPads, your computers. Those are all exits to intimacy. And so you can't be distracted. And then the important thing that I try and help couples do is be curious about your partner. And I think curiosity is a trait that you can harbor. One of the books that you'll find is called The Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. And I really like Brene Brown. She writes a lot about vulnerability. I think, and as I've said before, vulnerability is the part of intimacy. You cannot be emotionally intimate unless you're willing to be vulnerable. And the only way you're going to be vulnerable is if you
feel
feel
safe.
safe
Yep.
with your partner. And here's something she said: choosing to be curious is choosing to be vulnerable, which I agree with, because it requires us to surrender to uncertainty. If I ask you a question, I'm curious. I don't know what's the answer going to be.
Yeah.
And am I willing to hear whatever the answer is? We have to ask questions, admit to not knowing, risk being told that we shouldn't be asking, and sometimes make discoveries that lead to discomfort.
Okay.
But remember that you don't marry yourself. You
Yeah.
actually marry someone else. And one of the primary tasks of marriage is to learn to be comfortable with difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're choosing to be curious, there are all these messages that come across. It's, I'm interested in you. I want to know you as a person. And so the next step I get then is, okay, I don't know how to be curious. I don't know what the questions are to ask. And so one of the things that our listeners will find in the program notes is there's John Gottman has an app. Now, when I downloaded it on my phone, it was free. So I don't know if it's still free. I'm going to pull it up. And all the app says is Gottman card decks. And
Okay.
there are 14 different categories. For instance, love maps, open-ended question, rituals of connection, date questions, sex questions. And then he has three, I would guess these are around sex: salsa mild, salsa medium, and salsa hot. So you
Okay.
can use expressing needs. And so, like if I go on to date night, date questions. Now, the questions are simple. Do you have a sweet tooth or a savory tooth? Now, hopefully you know that.
Yeah.
And if you don't like the question, what did you like most about the place you grew up? What about it did you like least? So that's
Okay.
an interesting question that the couples may have never even thought to ask because it gives you a different insight. Like I might know where you grew
Mhm.
up, what did you like about it? And it can lead to a whole discussion. But see that, so if you don't know what are the questions asked, or when you're spending that time together, the Gottman card decks are one way to do it. And then another way to do it is there is a psychologist out of UC Berkeley. His name's Aron. So if you search, just go onto Google and search Aron 36 questions. Now, the premise of this, the 36 questions are in three sets of 12, and each set is intended to be a bit more probing than the previous set.
Okay.
And so, like, for instance, here's the first question. Given the choice of anyone in the world, whom would you want as a dinner guest? The second question, would you like to be famous? In what way? See, these are questions that you may not think of asking, but yet they're really a good way to learn how to do this process. And it gets you in this mode of being curious about what's the other person thinking. And so those questions, you'd want to answer them for each other. And just if our listeners go search this by Aron, what you'll find is he set out to find out if he could lead couples to fall in love.
Okay.
And he believes that these 36 questions will do that. And then the
Interesting.
final task, though, with this is you stare into each other's eyes for 4 minutes. And if you look on NPR, they did a story on this many years ago, but yeah, I think you can probably listen to it. And the person, I'm pretty sure I remember this correctly, the person who did this article actually found it to be true. I've actually had a client who this worked with.
Okay.
And for other reasons that didn't work out. And I don't know that he was happy that I suggested that he do this because he falls in love and then there are other issues going on. So I think it can work, but so we're talking about couples who've been in an established relationship. I
Hmm.
think it can be really helpful. So those are two options: the Gottman card decks and this Aron 36 question.
So,
So what you need is you need the time to do this. You need to take the time to sit down and talk to each other, learn how to talk to each other. Have you ever been in a restaurant? I think a lot of us have experienced this. And you look over at another table and there's a couple, they're both on the phone.
yeah.
They're not talking to each other.
Yep.
And I don't know why I feel such a sadness. I think this is so sad. You're sitting there, you're probably even texting, here I'm at dinner with my boyfriend or husband, but it is so sad that there's little connection. So I think there are a lot of good things about phones and there are a lot of hard things about phones. And this is one of
Yep.
them.
Yeah. Curtis and I established that rule years ago, and it's been great that when we go to a restaurant, our phones go away, right? And
That is a
so,
good rule to have.
yeah, I mean, in general, right? I mean, especially when it's just the two of us. So I have a couple of suggestions myself as far as increasing emotional intimacy. And the first one is take the 5 love languages quiz together.
Well, I like that. Yeah,
Yes.
that's a
Yeah.
good one.
And I like to take it. And Kurt and I took it very recently, and I wanted to see his answers because I was looking for ideas, and it'll give you a lot of really great ideas of how to show love to your partner. And it'll give you a lot of good ideas of how they like to be loved, how they like
Mhm.
to receive love, and how they're giving you love. Yeah, you can take it separately and then come back together and talk about your results. But I think it's helpful to take it with your partner. I mean, I guess unless maybe you feel pressure to give one answer or the other, then, maybe take it separately. But
well, you wouldn't feel the pressure, but I don't see any reason why not to. It can be you're using it maybe in a slightly different way than the author intended, but it's still
yeah,
a valid way to do it and get it. What you're getting
yeah,
is information
yes,
that's
yeah,
helpful for the relationship.
yeah. And then another suggestion, and you reference this book quite often, Mark, and that's Lies at the Altar by Robin Smith.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a section, 276 questions.
76 questions. That's a lot of questions.
Yes. So I was curious about it because, I mean, I never heard of this book until I'd been married for 9 years. And
Uh-huh.
so I went through and I was looking at these questions and I was like, I don't know the answer to some of these questions. Now, a lot of them I
Late for you,
did.
Liz, but go ahead and ask.
And I did. And let me tell you, I mean, we haven't even gotten all the way through all of the questions yet because,
Yeah.
I mean, it leads into a discussion between
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And it's been really fantastic. And so some of them some of them I just know. And so there's no discussion. But other ones I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. Tell me about this. And it leads into a really good dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you've been married for so many years, go back and check out those questions and see if there's an answer that you don't know.
I hadn't thought of it that way. I think that's a really good idea. I like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, next time you've got a couple in there.
I know. Okay, yeah, that's a lot of questions. That'll keep you busy for a while.
Oh, I mean, I started doing this. I think the first time you mentioned, it's been at least a year. And
Yeah.
it's not like we sit down all the time and go through them, but if we're out on a date or something and,
Mm-hmm.
or just if we have nothing to do, I'm like, hey, let's go through some more of these questions and talk about them.
Yeah. Robin Smith is the author of that book, Lies at
Yes.
the Altar.
And I will have all of this linked in our show notes for everyone, so our listeners so you don't have to try to go back and what did he say about that again? So I'll have them all listed for you. All right. So next week we're going to talk about a little bit of a different aspect of intimacy that is important. So I guess you could maybe even call it a continuation of this topic. So we're going to get into.
I think it is. I think it's a continuation. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's rekindling. And so I want to talk specifically about how to help a relationship when it's gone stale. And also some of the reasons of why it goes stale, because I think it's important to understand those as a preventative measure and as a why you've got where you are. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.